been looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, and when I started looking at it, I didn't realise how difficult this book was going to be to actually sort of dig into. But if you remember, Solomon had tremendous wealth, and last time I spoke, what Solomon was able to do was, with that tremendous wealth he had, he was able to do the things that human beings can do if they've got money. He went on these tremendous building projects. He made this fantastic house for himself. You know, it took him, I think, 13 years. He made the temple. And the thing with rich people is that they have money. They can sort of, well, whatever they want to do, they can do it. There's no restriction. But Solomon, even though he had all that wealth and was able to sort of satisfy his desires, I suppose, in whatever way he felt was right to do so, ultimately at the end of it, he felt unfulfilled. He thought, well, I've done all these things. You know, he went into drinking wine, drinking alcohol, sexual things, building projects, and spending his money on whatever he wanted. But once he'd done it all, he just saying, well, it's meaningless. I'm still unfulfilled. It still hasn't given me the satisfaction that I'm looking for. And as I said, it's a tremendous book really for the modern age, because the modern age, people are looking for wealth, they're looking for power, they're looking for status, they're looking for celebrity, they're looking to all these things. But if they only heeded what Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes, that ultimately these things are unfulfilling, then I'm sure a lot of people would actually save themselves a tremendous amount of heartache. But the thing is, well, what was Solomon trying to find, and what was he looking for? And we come to what I've termed God in Ecclesiastes. It's how is God revealed in this book? And what does Solomon say about God? And so we come to Ephesians chapter 3. This is, even if you might not know all the words, you'll know the sort of what this passage goes on to talk about. You'll have an understanding, probably remember aspects of it. But we start in Ecclesiastes 3:1, and Solomon writes this: there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. And then he goes on to talk about there's a time for this, a time for that. And he tends to have sort of opposites. And we'll look at those in a minute, but I just want to start off with this passage. What Solomon's saying is that there is a time and a season for every event under the heavens. There is the correct time to do something, and there is an incorrect time to do something. And it requires wisdom discerning which is which. But it is an important thing, I think, for us to understand that there is a correct time for doing things, and there is an incorrect time. There's also something in this first verse that is quite important. There's a phrase that Solomon uses in this book, and in the NIV version it occurs 29 times. And it's the phrase, under the sun. And a way of looking at that is, well, a worldly viewpoint, an under the sun viewpoint, a worldly viewpoint without including God in the equation, an under the sun viewpoint. As I say, Solomon uses that 29 times in the NIV version. But notice here he uses a different phrase, under the heavens. And that phrase, under the heavens, occurs twice in the book of Ecclesiastes. And a lot of commentators, and I tend to agree with them, although there are a couple of problems, but under the heavens mentality is different to the under the sun mentality. The under the sun mentality excludes God, but the under the heaven mentality includes God. And it's when you start including God in things that things take on a new perspective. It's interesting that Solomon starts off with this in Ecclesiastes 3, because Ecclesiastes 3 has the most references to God in it, in the sense of what God does. Chapter 5 of Ecclesiastes has the word God more frequently, but often it's in a more general sense, as in the house of God, or as in what people do for God or to God. Whereas in Ecclesiastes 3, it's far more about what God himself does, or the way God acts, what God is about. So in a sense, when Solomon talks about under the heavens, chapter 3 is quite a pivotal chapter, really, in indicating these are sort of the things that people do, men do, but this is what God himself does. So if we go into the next slide, and this is what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 3, 2-5. He says, there's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. If we go on the next slide, please, Julie. A time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. As I say, this is probably familiar to many people, Christians and non-Christians, these opposites, these complementary phrases, a time for this and a time for that. And knowing which is right, well, that requires wisdom. If we go to the next slide, we now come into Ecclesiastes 3:9. So we're continuing in this chapter. Solomon asks this question, what do workers gain from their toil? And the word gain here is more in the sense of profit. What profit is there from what people do? It's sort of an accounting term in the sense of income and expenditure. But if your expenditure taken from your income leaves something left over, then that's what Solomon is thinking about. What is left over? What remains? What fulfillment am I getting from all my toil? What is the benefit? What's the point? It's almost like you say, well, what is the legacy of what I do? And that's one of the recurring themes in Ecclesiastes, is that he says, well, I can do all these activities. I can build these tremendous buildings. I can do these gardens and parks and irrigation systems. But he says, well, when I die, I can't take it with me. I've got all this wealth, but at the end of the day, when I go, I leave it to somebody else. And one of his questions is, well, I don't know whether the people after me are going to be wise with that or not. But he sees the futility in storing up all this wealth, only to come to the end of his life and find, well, I can't take it with me anyway. What's the point? And that's what he's looking for. He's looking for point. He's looking for significance. He's looking for a reason. He's looking for purpose. He's looking for fulfillment. So he asks a question, well, what do people gain? What do workers gain from their toil? What's the point? If we go on to the next slide, Solomon says this in Ecclesiastes 3:10. He says, I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race. In a sense, he's looking at it from a sort of a human perspective, but he is quite accurate that actually there is this burden on humanity, in the sense that it is never fulfilled, it's never really happy, it never really knows its point, its significance, its reason for being. Life is incredibly short. what's the point? But then we start coming into some of these wonderful phrases that occur in Ecclesiastes 3 that talk about God. And if we go to the next slide. Ecclesiastes 3:11a says this: God has made everything beautiful in its time. That's a tremendous phrase, but it's talking about God. He's now bringing God into the equation. What does God do? I've seen what men do, I've seen what I've done, but what does God do? And he comes to this one tremendous fact: God does everything beautiful in its time. The word beautiful in this verse actually does mean beautiful as well. It significantly, most of the times it gets used, it means beautiful or handsome or fair. Occasionally it gets translated in some translations as appropriate. But the main meaning of the word is to be beautiful. And I was thinking, well, that is God's perspective. What he creates beautiful. He doesn't know how to do anything else. That's what he does. He creates beautiful. And the other thing is, he creates it beautiful in its time. It's like God puts whatever he does it at the relevant time, the correct time. We are here at the correct time. We are not born too early. We are not born too late. We are, according to the words here, beautiful in his time. We're here at the correct time, and that's what he does. And when I look at the natural world that God has created, I can't but stand in awe of it. It is beautiful. Absolutely staggeringly beautiful. I don't know how many of you watched the 100k drop, but there was a question on it a couple of weeks ago, and the answer was 4 fruits. And then it gave a picture of a duck, and they said, well, what type of duck is it? And the answer to the question was a mandarin duck. Now, I don't know what a mandarin duck looks like. I don't know if you know what a mandarin duck looks like, but the next slide will show you. It's stunning. And this is just a duck. If you can say such just a duck. It's glorious, it's beautiful. God has created it beautiful in his time. And if you look through the whole of nature, created nature, you will see this beauty. In the kitchen, I often look out into the garden, you see the birds feeding, and it's stunning. Sometimes they're not beautiful in perhaps a conventional sense, but they're beautiful in their sort of, just what they do. They're stunning. We've got, I think it's 6 baby chaffinches or blue tits, or don't know what they are, no idea. But they're so playful, all 6 of them are sort of flying around. And we've got a peanut feeder, and the big birds are quite happy to come into the peanut feeder, and they'll get this massive peanut in their beak. And then they'll fly off, they obviously want to go and eat it somewhere safe. But these little baby ones, I've seen them, they've come in to the feeder, but they can't get their beak around the peanut. They're too small. They've now grown up and they can do it. But it's enchanting. But that to me is the whole of God's creation. It's enchanting. It's beautiful. It's staggering. And this picture of a duck, you think of the many types of coloured birds there are and animals. They're stunning. Even the ones that perhaps you consider are not overly attractive actually have something about them which I find quite amazing. But this is, God has created everything beautiful in his time. And in a sense, we have to look at ourselves and think, well, that is what God has done. God has created me beautiful in his time. I'm here at the right time. We may argue with that. We may say, well, no, that's not right, God. You haven't made me beautiful in my time. But the Word of God is true. Whatever God creates is beautiful in his time. We go on to the next slide. We continue in Ecclesiastes 3:11. And I've included, these are both versions out of the NIV. The NIV has got a postscript. They don't basically know how to translate the first phrase. So what they do is they give a sort of an alternative translation. And I think, in a sense, both of these are actually correct. Ecclesiastes 3:11b says this: He, God, has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Or the alternative is, He has also placed ignorance in the human heart, so that no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. But if you look at both of those, you say, well, the first one, God has put eternity into the human heart. There is something within a human being that, even though Ecclesiastes starts off by saying there is a time to be born and a time to die, there is still something within us which thinks, hang on a minute, why? Why do we cease to exist? Why should that happen? And I think within people there is this sense of, well, there must be more. But that's what Solomon is really doing in this book. He's looking for the more. Where is the more? Where is the fulfillment? But you could also look at the second part and say, well, he has placed ignorance in the human heart. In a sense, he's done that as well, that there is something that we cannot understand God. It's too complicated, it's too big. We are human, and anything beyond us is just, even if you don't believe in God, you can't help but be astounded by what's out there and realize how small and insignificant you really are in the great scheme of things. We can't fathom humanly what God has done from the beginning to the end. It's too vast, it's too amazing, it's too staggering. But in a sense, it's almost like God has limited us because, well, you're just human beings, but I am God. Gives us a sense of perspective. We go to the next slide. We've looked at this before, but again, this is talking about God. Solomon says, I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live. Enjoy the day, I think, is what basically Solomon's getting at. Enjoy the day. Don't worry about tomorrow. Forget the past. Enjoy the day. Be satisfied with today. That each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. But notice this, it's what God wants for people to be satisfied, to find satisfaction. If you don't have satisfaction in your life, then you're missing what God wants for you. But then Solomon finishes this passage where he says, this is a gift of God. And we looked last time at the gift of God. It's a gift. God generously and wonderfully hands out the gift of satisfaction in life, the ability to enjoy life. But as I said last time, the problem is many people won't receive the gift. They won't receive from God what he wants to give. Or they misunderstand the gift, or they think the gift is inappropriate, or they think the gift is, well, not worth having. Well, the gift of God is to find satisfaction in life, to find enjoyment. And in a sense, this is what Solomon's looking for. But he's quite astute here in saying, well, actually, it's a gift of God. If you're looking to find enjoyment and satisfaction and fulfillment on the human plane in a human way, you will ultimately be unfulfilled. But it's from the gift of God that you find satisfaction and fulfillment. We come on to the next slide, and this is another tremendous thing that Solomon says about God, Ecclesiastes 3:14a. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it. He's getting to a point here that he's saying, well, what God does has an eternal quality to it. God doesn't just do something and then, temporary. Whatever God does is eternal. and it has purpose, and it has point, and it has reason. It will endure forever. If God had his way, whatever he does would endure forever, because that's the way he wants it to be. It has an eternal nature about it. And Solomon also adds that nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. And in a sense, this is a state of security. Whatever God does is secure, it's permanent, it's eternal. You can't take away from it, you can't make it insecure, you can't add to it. It doesn't need adding to, because what God does is always 100% right. You can't subtract from it and you can't add to it. With regards to the next slide, which is the full verse 14. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. As I say, complicated, and I don't quite get all the ins and outs of that, but it's like God operates and works, and he does it in such a way that actually there is this interaction with people. People are involved, and he wants people to respect what he's doing, understand what he's doing, revere him, be in awe of him. But it's not done so that, oh, you've got to fear me. It's done because I want to incorporate you into what I'm doing. What I do has permanence. What I do endures. What I do has security. And I want you to be part of that. I want you to get involved in that. I looked at another version of that verse. So if we go to the Message version of that, I've also concluded that whatever God does, that's the way it's going to be, always. No addition, no subtraction. God's done it, and that's it. And that's so we'll quit asking questions and simply worship in holy fear. It might be a more, well, Eugene Patterson's way of looking at things. But I do like sometimes the way he just sort of tips things around and gets you thinking. But that's his way of looking at it. But the thing to take from that verse is the permanence of what God does, the eternal nature of it, how secure it is, how 100% correct it is. We go to the next slide. I incorporated this because I thought, well, the one thing about that verse in Ecclesiastes says, whatever God does, he does it so that people will fear him. Well, if we come to Romans 1:20-21, you get Paul's angle, the Apostle Paul's angle. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. But the interesting thing is that since the creation of the world, God's eternal nature, God's power, what God does, and he's done it in the entire universe, and he's done it in creation. But all the nature of God, his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen. People cannot say to God when they see him at last, well, I didn't know about you. You know, you didn't reveal yourself to me. This verse explicitly says that God has revealed himself to everyone through what he does. You can't, I don't think, I mean, how anybody can look at the natural created world and say it evolved, it just came about, it's chance, it's too wonderful. It's been designed. Somebody with power and creative artistic flair has brought this world into being. How anybody in their right mind can say evolution is, it's just, to me, it's just stupid. It doesn't hold up. And here, Paul in Romans says that his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. It's been understood from what has been made. And then he adds that phrase, people are without excuse. Nobody can ever say to God, you did not reveal yourself to me. because creation has done it in a tremendous way. We go to the next slide, to go back to Ecclesiastes 3. And I just thought, Solomon has started it off with saying there's a time to be born and a time to die. And my thought was, when I read this, you tend to think of this in sort of natural terms. Natural birth followed by natural death, or unnatural death maybe. But one follows the other. And I thought, well, is that the way with God? And yet God reverses this in the New Testament. I'll just show you a couple of verses. John 3:3, Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they're born again." So there's this new birth, being born again. But in Colossians 3:3 we read this, "For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God." You died, and now you're alive. Whereas in Ecclesiastes, it's the other way round. You're born and you die. But you see, we're getting back to the heart of God. This is what God is all about. Because once you die and you're born again with the Lord, you then take on the eternal nature that God wanted his creation to have in the very first instance. His eternal nature has been imparted to us through the death of Christ. And that's what God's wanted. He's wanted that which lasts, which is secure. He wants us to be secure. He wants us to be eternal. He wants us to be complete. Solomon couldn't see that fully in Ecclesiastes, although he had glimpses to it. But it's only when you get to the New Testament that you see the revelation of what Solomon had a glimpse of, but which is now possible because of the work of Christ. We come to the next slide, Ecclesiastes 3:15. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. Again, slightly difficult, but in a sense Solomon is saying, well, I think he's talking about the timeless nature of God. You know, what is tomorrow and what is now, to God it's all the same. Past, present and future. Alpha and Omega. We go to the amplified version of that verse. That which is has already been, and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by, so that history repeats itself. And in a sense, we know history repeats itself. You know, generations come, generation goes. History does repeat itself, and as the adage says, history repeats itself because nobody learns the lessons the first time round, or the second or the third. That's why history repeats itself. Nobody learns the lessons. And if we go to the Message version of that verse, whatever was is, whatever will be is. That's how it always is with God. We have a sense of time. I don't think God has a sense of time. He can be Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, timeless. Ecclesiastes 3:16-17. Next slide, please, Jen. Solomon says this, "I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there." What he looks at the judicial system. He says, well, you can look at the judicial system, but there can be corruptness within it. Justice is not served. But then he says to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. But in a sense, that's the thing. Another aspect of God is the fact that he is just, he is right. But that whatever injustice there may be in this world, God always fixes. Might not be here, might be in the future, but God is a just God. And this is what Solomon is recognizing. Humanity is not just all the time. God is. And that is an aspect that Solomon brings out. God is always just and right and righteous. Ecclesiastes 3:18, the next slide. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them, so that they may see they are like the animals. what Solomon has recognized is that actually humanity, human beings, because of what's happened, because of the fall, they've become like animals. I think in a sense that are a bit unjust to animals, but I prefer the way other versions translate it. If we go to the next slide, the classic amplified version says, "I said in my heart regarding the subjects of the Son of Man, God is trying, separating and sifting them, that they may see that by themselves, under the sun without God, they are but like beasts." And I think beasts is the more correct wording here. Human beings have lost the glory God wanted to have, and they have become beasts. That's an awful state to be, beast-like. But Solomon recognized that's what had happened to humanity. And he realized that God would show people somehow, one way or another, look, you are like beasts. You're behaving like beasts. You're behaving like animals. And that's not what I intended for you. And that's a dreadful statement on Solomon's part, but unfortunately true. And if we go to the next, well, this is actually a different version of this. It's Young's literal translation. But it brings in an interesting concept. I said in my heart concerning the matter of the sons of man, that God might cleanse them so as to see that they themselves are beasts. It's an interesting way of looking at it, that if people recognize that they are beast-like, they're not as God originally intended, but they would need cleansing to get them back to the point that God originally had for them, and that would require the cleansing work of Christ. I'm going to leave it there because that's a look at Ecclesiastes 3. It's not the easiest of chapters, but hopefully I've given you perhaps a bit of insight into what's going on there. But the great thing is that God is mentioned, that even if you just took away one phrase, God has made everything beautiful in his time. That is a wonderful statement about the way God operates. And under the heavens, a heavenly, godly, divine perspective on what he does compared to what humanity thinks and does. Amen.